It was the spring of 1995, and professional basketball was navigating the strangest period in its modern history. The Chicago Bulls, the team that had defined the sport for half a decade, were attempting to function without the person who had made them what they were. Michael Jordan had walked away from basketball in October of 1993, 18 months earlier, citing exhaustion from the relentless pressure of being the most scrutinized athlete on the planet and the devastating grief of losing his father to a senseless act of violence that summer. He had not retired in the way that athletes usually retire, with ceremony and speeches and the formal acknowledgement of an ending. He had simply stepped away quietly and without much warning, leaving a sport that had organized itself around his presence to figure out what it was without him. What the NBA was without Jordan turned out to be genuinely interesting in ways that the league had not anticipated. Shaquille O'Neal had arrived with a physical dominance that seemed to belong to a different category of human athlete. Penny Hardaway was combining size and skill in ways that suggested a new template for what a basketball player could be. David Robinson and Hakeem Olajuwon were competing at levels that reminded observers that the sport's depth of excellence extended far beyond any single player. The Houston Rockets had won the championship in 1994 behind Olajuwon's extraordinary performance and were on their way to winning again in 1995. The league was demonstrating, in other words, that it could survive the absence of its most famous practitioner. But there was something missing that statistics and standings could not fully account for. There was a quality of attention that the sport had carried during Jordan's years that was different from ordinary sports attention, a sense that basketball was participating in something larger than a competition, that it was producing moments and performances that belonged to a conversation about human excellence that extended beyond the boundaries of athletic achievement. That quality had not disappeared entirely in Jordan's absence, but it had diminished in a way that the people most invested in the sport could feel, even if they struggled to articulate it precisely. Jordan spent his 18 months away from basketball, attempting something that surprised almost everyone who thought they understood him. He pursued professional baseball. He signed a minor league contract with the Chicago White Sox organization and reported to spring training with the same seriousness and preparation that had characterized everything he had ever done in a competitive context. The baseball world received him with a mixture of curiosity, skepticism, and in certain quarters open condescension. He was 30 years old, attempting to learn at a professional level a sport that most of its practitioners had been developing since childhood, bringing to it the work ethic and competitive intensity that had made him the best basketball player alive, but lacking the years of accumulated muscle memory that baseball at any professional level requires. The coverage of his baseball experiment was unsparing in its skepticism. Writers who had spent years celebrating his basketball achievements found a different register when writing about his baseball struggles, something that contained more than ordinary critical assessment, a quality of relish that was uncomfortable to examine directly, but unmistakable in the texture of the prose. He was batting in the low 200s in the minors. His fielding was adequate, but not exceptional. The consensus in baseball circles was that he was a famous person attempting a difficult sport, and that the outcome was precisely what anyone with knowledge of baseball development would have predicted. Several prominent baseball figures said publicly, and without apparent discomfort, that Jordan had no realistic future in professional baseball, and that the experiment, while admirable in its intention, demonstrated the limits of athletic transferability in ways that were instructive if not particularly surprising. What these assessments missed, and what became clear only in retrospect, was what the baseball experiment was doing to Jordan that had nothing to do with batting averages or fielding percentages. He was learning, for the first time since early adolescence, what it felt like to be genuinely bad at something athletic in public, to be assessed and found wanting by experts in a domain where his competence was real but insufficient, to compete seriously and fall short, not because of effort or will, but because of the accumulated gap between what he had and what the situation required. This experience was doing something to him that success at the highest level of basketball had not been able to do, which was reminding him with daily specificity what it felt like to want something that was not yet within reach. And that feeling, uncomfortable and humbling and occasionally mortifying, was doing something to his relationship with basketball that nobody outside his immediate circle could see. The announcement came in March of 1995. 2 words on a fax sent to media organizations. "I'm back." The simplicity of it was characteristic in a way that only became apparent afterward. Jordan did not hold a press conference, did not give an extensive interview explaining his thinking, did not manage the narrative with the careful public relations architecture that surrounded most significant announcements in professional sports. 2 words. The economy of it communicated something about his relationship with the public dimension of his career, which was that the public dimension was not the thing that mattered to him and never had been. The reaction to the announcement was immediate and enormous, and divided in ways that the original retirement had not been divided. Celebration was the dominant register, but underneath it ran a current of skepticism that was new in the discourse around Jordan. He had been away for 18 months. He was 31 years old. He had spent that time playing a different sport at a level that experts in that sport had assessed as insufficient for professional competition. The question being asked in sports media within hours of the announcement was not whether Jordan's return was welcome. It was whether Jordan's return was wise, whether the person who came back would be recognizable as the person who had left, whether what he had been before was still there after everything that had intervened. Several prominent voices in basketball went further than simply raising the question. A former NBA executive said on national television that Jordan had made a mistake, that the physical conditioning required to compete at the level he had previously established could not be recovered in the time available before the playoffs, and that returning mid-season was a decision driven by emotion rather than judgment. A prominent basketball analyst wrote that Jordan's greatest risk in returning was not failure to win a championship, but something more permanent, which was the replacement of his existing legacy with a diminished final chapter that would color how everything before it was remembered. He wrote that Jordan at 31, returning from 18 months away, was a fundamentally different proposition from Jordan at 29 in his prime, and that the sport owed it to his legacy to say so honestly rather than celebrating a return that might ultimately damage what had been built. These were not unreasonable arguments. They were made by intelligent people who understood basketball and who were applying the principles that governed athletic performance in general to a specific situation. The problem was that the principles that governed athletic performance in general had never been fully applicable to Jordan in the specific. His career had been a sustained demonstration that the variables which constrained other elite athletes operated differently in his case, not because the laws of physiology did not apply to him, but because the factors that determine how those laws express themselves in performance, the competitive drive, the preparation, the basketball intelligence, the capacity to access something in high-stakes moments that exists below the level of physical condition, were present in him at a magnitude that made ordinary assessments unreliable. He played his first game back on March 19, 1995, for the Bulls against the Indiana Pacers. He wore number 45, having retired number 23 along with his basketball career. The building in Indianapolis was sold out in a way that buildings are sold out when people understand they are not simply attending a game, but witnessing a moment that will be referenced for a long time afterward. Jordan scored 19 points. He was rusty in observable ways, his timing slightly off on certain moves, his conditioning not yet at the level his performances had previously required. He made mistakes that the earlier version of him would not have made, but he was also unmistakably himself in the ways that mattered most. The competitive presence, the basketball intelligence, the quality of attention he brought to every possession that made teammates perform better and opponents uncomfortable. The Bulls made the playoffs that year. They were not the team they had been in their championship years. The roster had changed significantly in Jordan's absence, and the surrounding cast had not been assembled with the expectation of his return. They reached the second round and lost to the Orlando Magic in a series that contained the moment most often cited as evidence for the skeptics. In Game 1, with the Bulls trailing late, Jordan had the ball in his hands in a position to win the game, and was stripped by Nick Anderson, a guard who was an excellent player but not the kind of player who, in the championship years, would have been able to take the ball from Jordan in that situation. Anderson made the play and the Bulls eventually lost in overtime. After the game, Anderson said something to a reporter that became one of the most repeated quotes of that playoff season. He said that number 45 was not number 23. He said it respectfully, as an observation rather than a provocation, but the observation carried the weight of everything the skeptics had been saying, the suggestion that the Jordan who had returned was a version of the Jordan who had left, similar enough to recognize but different enough to matter. Jordan heard the quote. The circumstances under which he heard it varied depending on who told the story, but the fact of his hearing it was consistent across every account. And the accounts also agreed on his reaction, which was not anger exactly, but a kind of settling, a clarification of purpose that occurred in the space between hearing the words and deciding what to do about them. He went back to number 23 the following game, having requested and received permission from the league to make the switch. It was a symbolic act, but symbols in the context of Jordan's career were never merely symbols. They were statements of intention, made in a language that the person making them intended to back with performance. The summer of 1995 was where the return actually began, in the sense that mattered. Jordan spent it in a preparation that people who witnessed it described as unlike anything they had seen from him before, which was a significant statement, given that his preparation had always been exceptional. He brought in workout partners and worked them until they needed to be replaced with fresh ones. He studied film of the Magic series with the specific attention of someone who is not reviewing what happened in order to understand the past, but in order to prevent the past from repeating itself. He worked on every component of his game with the systematic thoroughness of someone who had been told that the components were insufficient and had accepted the assessment as accurate and was now doing something about it. Phil Jackson described Jordan in training camp before the 1995-96 season as the most prepared he had ever seen him, which was a statement that required a moment to absorb because the earlier version had been extraordinarily prepared. What Jackson meant was not that Jordan was working harder, because harder was not a concept that had meaningful application to his preparation. What Jackson meant was that Jordan's preparation had a quality of intentionality that went beyond the physical work. He was preparing with a specific destination in mind, not the abstract destination of excellence or championship, but the specific destination of demonstrating something to everyone who had questioned whether the Jordan who came back was the same as the Jordan who had left. The 1995-96 Chicago Bulls won 72 games. The record had never been approached in the history of the NBA and has not been equaled in the years since. Jordan won the scoring title, averaged 30 points per game, and played with a completeness and consistency that made the arguments about his diminishment seem not merely wrong, but almost incomprehensible in retrospect. He was not the same Jordan who had left in 1993. He was something more considered and more complete, a player whose competitive intensity had been refined by absence into something that burned at a different temperature than it had before. Steadier and more controlled, and ultimately more devastating because it was more precisely directed. They won the championship that year. Then they won it again in 1997, which included the flu game that would stand as perhaps the most iconic individual performance in finals history. Then they won it again in 1998, with Jordan making the shot over Brian Russell in the final seconds of Game 6 that closed the dynasty, in the way that only the most perfectly constructed stories close, with a single image that contains everything the story was about. 3 consecutive championships after the return. 3 straight titles from a player who had been told that what he had been was gone, and who had responded to that assessment with the only language he had ever trusted, which was performance at a level that made the assessment impossible to sustain. The voices that had questioned the return did not disappear quietly. Some of them acknowledged their error directly and with genuine grace. The analyst who had written about the risk of a diminished final chapter wrote a follow-up piece after the 3rd championship that was notable for its honesty, acknowledging that he had applied correct principles to an incorrect premise, that the principles governing normal athletic careers were real and valid, but that Jordan was not a normal athletic career and had never been one, and that the failure to account for that distinction was an analytical failure that the subsequent 3 years had made impossible to ignore. Other voices simply moved on without acknowledgement, which is the more common human response to having been substantially wrong about something that a lot of people were watching. What the return ultimately demonstrated was not simply that Jordan could still play at an elite level after 18 months away and a season of baseball. It demonstrated something more interesting and more durable than that. It demonstrated that the qualities which produced his greatness were not purely physical in nature, and therefore were not subject to the same timeline of decline that purely physical qualities follow. The basketball intelligence, the competitive architecture, the capacity to access in critical moments something that went below the level of physical condition and operated from a different source, these things had not diminished during his absence. They had, in some respects that were difficult to fully account for, deepened. The baseball experiment, the humbling and the struggle and the daily experience of insufficiency, had done something to his relationship with his own excellence that made the return not simply a restoration, but an upgrade, a version of Jordan that had been forced by circumstance to understand itself more completely than the uninterrupted version ever had to. 3 championships, 72 wins, the flu game, the last shot. The dynasty completed on its own terms, in its own time, by the person who had built it, returning from an absence that everyone had been told would make return impossible. The NBA had questioned whether he was still what he had been. The answer came back across 3 consecutive seasons in the most unambiguous form that competitive sport makes available. He was not what he had been. He was what came after what he had been, and what came after turned out to be the best version of all.